I'll begin just, the sort of standard, how did this all come about? I think at the time of Moon, it was announced that your next film was going to be a movie called Mute, and this kind of breaks the pattern of a four-letter title starting with M. Was that a big point of departure?
I tried to get them to rename it, they wouldn't do it. Yeah, I mean, I actually tried to make Mute before I made Moon. And it was definitely too ambitious for a first feature film. And it was definitely the right call, to do Moon first. But I did have, these aspirations that I would have the chance to make Mute next. And that was one of the reasons I was able to meet up with Jake Gyllenhaal. He'd seen Moon and seemed to very much like it. I'm a huge admirer of his and really wanted to work with him. And we met up to discuss what I hoped was going to be Mute. And he said, I had this great script you should really have a read of. And he gave me source code, and I went home and I read it, and I actually thought, I think there's something I can do with this. There's something I can do with this. And yeah, I loved the pace of it. I was really interested in the science fiction conceit at the heart of it. And it seemed to do so many things. There was a romance to it, there was the opportunity to really put some humor into it. And in my mind, it was so different than Moon. After the fact, I've realized it's actually not as different in some ways.
Very many symmetries, including the actor being in a very tightly confined space. Maybe talk a little bit, actually, about your interest in science fiction as a genre and what some of your influences were.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely consider myself a science fiction fan. My dad always liked me to read every evening. For an hour or two a night, we would try and make sure that I read something growing up. And if I was finding it difficult or frustrating, whatever it was I was reading at the time, science fiction was kind of my candy. That was to sort of lure me into reading more. So whether it was George Orwell's Animal Farm or John Wyndham's Day of the Triffids, or later on Philip K. Dick and J.G. Ballard and William Gibson, those were the things that I really kind of enjoyed. So that's kind of what started my science fiction interests. But I loved the opportunity to look at what-if stories. To take, even if like J.G. Ballard, where you sort of look at the world very much as it is, and then just tweak one thing and just change it slightly and say, yeah, but what if the world were like this? And then it sort of gives you a whole new perspective on the world that we live in.
And just in case there's a few people out there who don't know who your dad is, maybe you can say.
He's a musician.
Talk about the physical shoot of this movie as opposed to Moon, which, if I recall, was supposedly on such an elaborate set that people had to enter through an airlock, basically, like people on a space station. Here, obviously, there's some stuff that's in a set, but a lot that's on location also. But how is that different in terms of conceiving of the look of the film, the style of the film?
There were many similarities. I mean, there was some difference, but there were many similarities. And I can't help but think that Jake's optimism that I would be the right person to work on this film was the fact that I had dealt with claustrophobic environments and had managed to visually keep them looking quite varied. Because there's the interior of the train, which is a set that we built in Montreal. Most of the shoot was in Montreal. So there's the interior of the train. There was what we called the pod, which is this sort of holding area in between missions for Coulter, and then the lab environment where Vera Farmiga and Jeffrey Wright are based. And those were all in Montreal. We built the exterior of the train station in a parking lot, also in Montreal as well. And we can talk about that a little bit, because there was this constant desire to try and seed the film with ideas and influences and occasional in-jokes as well. There's sort of Hitchcock vibe that we wanted in the film, from the opening source code, title, and graphics. Sorry, I'm going off on one now.
Well, and the Bernard Herrmann-esque score.
Yeah, absolutely. And the clock towers on the platform and on the train station, and the way that Jake is dressed in this sort of fairly traditional sort of jacket tie that's a little bit out of period. And then, of course, the score itself.
Well, and there is, I mean, even though it's a science fiction movie, there is the sort of feeling of film noir, of, the one man who knows what everyone else doesn't know, that kind of a vibe to it. I mean, what are some of, outside of science fiction, some of the films and the filmmakers, and the genres that have inspired you?
Outside of science fiction, for me, I know that Ben Ripley, who wrote the script, he obviously had his own influences. But for me, it was films like 39 Steps and North by Northwest. We were trying to find a couple of Hitchcock vibes. The idea of a mysterious dame on a train and an ordinary guy who finds himself in outrageous circumstances and trying to work out what's going on. It seemed fairly classic. I mean, other than the science fiction ideas, it was a very traditional story in many ways.
And of course, those movies did have a strong comic component to them
Absolutely.
as well.
Yeah.
And I mean, of course, 39 Steps was turned into a Broadway comedy recently, but is it difficult to find that balance between the serious elements and the comedic elements, and how much of that was in the script, and how much of that was something you were finessing in the performances and in the editing room?
I think one of the reasons Jake and I clicked very early on is we both felt that the script structurally was very sound. We loved the pace of it, but we both felt that the film would probably work better if we injected humor into it, if we found a way to lighten the tone. I felt the script took itself quite seriously. There was some sort of on-the-nose comic moments, but the whole thing took itself quite seriously, and that was sort of one thing I wanted to do. That was kind of my interpretation of it, was to try and lighten it. And because we shot the scenes in the train first, that was really, that was the first opportunity we had to really set that tone. And the interplay between Michelle and Jake and the other passengers on the train, that was a fun few opening weeks, because we really had the opportunity to push it a little too far and go a little bit surreal with it. And then in the edit, working with the master, Paul Hirsch, we had the opportunity to really fine-tune it and set the tone.
I want to take some questions from the audience for Duncan. Yes, here.
Other than the comedic elements, how much did the script change between what you and Jake were first talking about and the finished film? Like, were there things that didn't make any sense or stuff that what kind of changes did you make on it?
A question about how much the film changed from the script stage to what we see now.
I think I found the script to be very successful, both structurally and in the way that it interweaved all of these different facets, the romance, the mystery, the action. So I didn't want to mess with that. The only thing was really the tone for me that I wanted to change, and then we came to the ending, and I really felt like there was something missing. Because originally the ending was a very straightforward, romantic, happy ending, and it didn't work for me. I just found it too saccharine. And as a sci-fi geek, there was this loose thread that I just couldn't help wanting to address. I couldn't let it go. Well, okay, so the ending. Do you want to skip right to the end?
People have seen the movie now.
Okay.
Giving anything away.
If you assume that Colt Stevens is right, and he's basically jumping from a reality where he is being sent on a mission to a parallel reality, it's not just that he's living the last 8 minutes of someone else's life. He's actually being shifted into a parallel reality and into the past of that parallel reality, where he's able to stop a train from blowing up. So that means that there is obviously, in this parallel reality, another Colter Stevens at the facility where Goodwin is based, who has not yet been sent on a mission because the train never blew up. So it's really important in my mind that he is able to let Goodwin know that this Colter needs to be saved. But I think what I really liked about it is, rather than just having the happy ending, you have all sorts of ethical implications at this point. Because by Colter jumping into this parallel reality, he's basically booted Sean Fentress out of his own body and killed him. He's also repeated this event of performing the source code, and each time that he's failed, he's created an entirely new reality where a terrorist event has occurred. Successfully. So he's actually killing hundreds of people, let alone one. Yeah, well, that's a starting point. Those are the things that I found kind of interesting, and I didn't want to let them go.
There'll be an exam on this. Other questions? Here. the questions about the theories about parallel reality, how much of it is Duncan's, how much is the writers, how much comes from people like Philip Dick and J.G. Ballard.
It's funny because Ben Ripley wrote this script, and it was a new experience for me to come on board someone else's idea, someone else's world, and try and realize it. You know, while we were making the film, I actually only had a brief opportunity to talk to Ben, and it was really, he came down to visit the set while we were in the middle of shooting, and we sort of, you know, said hello, and he said how much he loved what we were doing, and that was it. It wasn't until after we finished the film that I really got a chance to catch up with Ben and really make sure that I understood what it was that he was writing. Fortunately, I think we were pretty much on the same, you know, we had the same interpretation of what it was that he was going after. I think being a stickler for detail, I really wanted to get a little bit more into at least what the repercussions were of the science fiction conceit that he'd come up with. I know that in early drafts of the script, he had included an awful lot more description and exposition of how the source code worked, and I think sensibly he pulled a lot of that out, because that's not what the film's about. I mean, it's important to set up the world and the idea, but really it's about Colter Stevens and Christina, this woman he meets on the train, and Captain Goodwin, and it's about the relationships between those people and how they change, you know, over the course of the film. Don't know if that answers it, but...
Back there, yeah.
On the train when, they didn't remember this one, but on the train when Coulter learns that he's been reported dead, like in that moment, things got all pixelated for him, and then he went back to the holding room or whatever without being exploited. I didn't quite follow why that happened.
Yeah. Question about when Coulter jumps back into the cell after he learns that he's been reported dead and everything gets all pixelated. What was happening there?
I guess, you know, we play a little poetic license there. The idea that the information he's receiving is so overwhelming that it kind of distorts this bridge that he's been able to have to a parallel reality. So he's kind of, you know, he's sort of sucked back through because of that complete crash of his understanding of the reality and the new information that he's being given.
So is he at risk for that happening again?
At the end of the film, I think he's pretty much. I think he's stabilized by then. I think he's, and I think there's not really any way to go back to at that point because Goodwin has shut him down in the original reality.
Although it does beg the question that your new ending conveniently leaves the door open for a source code too. Is that something you would consider?
If I could get mute made, I'd do it. No, I'm very happy with the film we've made, and I'm very excited about, you know, launching it out into the water now and seeing how it floats. But you know,
there's a lot of potential. You could have kind of like a psychotropic James Bond.
you could. There's a lot of opportunities. We'll see. You know, we'll see what happens with the film. I feel like my plate runneth over, rather than my cup.
Other questions? Back there, yes.
Was Russell Peters considered a choice when running out of ideas for humor, or just thrown in there?
Oh, question. Russell Peters, that's the comedian, yes. Was he considered, how did he get the role?
Russell Peters was a massive risk and a massive opportunity for us. There was comedy written in the script. It was okay. It was pretty good. It wasn't the best, you know, but Ben Ripley did a noble effort with it. But the opportunity to work with a stand-up comedian, someone who does this for a living, was too good to pass over. We offered him the opportunity to write his own material at the end of the film, and I naively allowed him to not show it to me until we started shooting. When it came to shooting day, he did it, and it was hysterical, but it was so bloody rude that we could hardly use any of it. It wasn't PG-13 rating applicable. Maybe we'll get the opportunity to put it on the DVD because it's very funny. It's just too blue. We couldn't use it. So there was a couple of little slices that we were able to put in there, and I think they were enough for the job that we needed to do in the film. I think it would have been lovely to get a couple of great one-liners in there, a bit more comedy, but there just wasn't enough material that was usable.
Here.
You mentioned the PG-13 rating. Did you have any other restraints working in the studio system that affected your process that was either a challenge or an opportunity?
A question about whether, other than the PG-13 rating, there were any studio-imposed conditions, or what it was like working in the studio system on this movie.
Well, I mean, in regards to the PG-13 rating, the only other area where it really came up, well, there were two actually. There was the number of swear words. You know, you can say fuck once, and we were very selective as to where that would be used. It's like our power tool at that moment. And then we obviously had the body, the reveal, which was a real balance as far as getting the what I needed across, which was I wanted the audience to understand he's not getting up and going anywhere. You know, if he's not going to save himself. So that was really important. And at the same level, we had to make sure that it wasn't so gruesome as I would originally have intended it, that we couldn't actually show it. So we came up with the balance that we've got there. As far as how I myself found myself having to deal with the situation, it was actually it was fairly benign. I went through a learning curve, obviously, coming off of an independent film where myself, my producer Stuart Finnegan, and Sam Rockwell made all the decisions. You know, when we were making Moon, it was basically the three of us. We'd make a decision, and we could move like that and add a scene if we wanted to, or just change it dramatically. When you're working on a film like this and you're spending millions of dollars of other people's money, you really have to be very careful and make sure that you're able to help everyone understand the decisions you're making and make sure that they all feel comfortable with that move. Sometimes it's a little bit like the difference between, you know, driving a speedboat and captaining an oil tanker. You know, you have to move incrementally, and you have to plan very much ahead and help everyone understand where it is you're trying to get to. But that's actually a really useful discipline to have anyway, and it's something I used to do in the commercial industry anyway. So it's something I was familiar with.
Mm-hmm.
It's a question about what's going on when Coulter is inside the capsule and he sees the leaking hydraulic fluid, or it's cold, and all those kind of environmental changes, if this is all just a manifestation of his mind.
Yeah, I think you kind of were onto it. The idea is that the physical body of Coulter Stevens at the Nellis Air Force Base is having its own physiological responses to what's going on to it, and he's interpreting those in the manifestation. So if he's running a temperature, going through cold sweats, starting to leak bodily fluid, any of those things are being incorporated into that manifestation. So he may go through what he believes is the capsule freezing, or, you know, there are liquids just leaking from the walls. All of those things are being incorporated into that. And, I mean, to expand on that notion, he starts off in a pod which is much smaller and more coherent to him. It makes sense in that the last thing he remembers is being a helicopter pilot in Afghanistan. What he starts off in is something which is obviously not a helicopter, but it feels like some kind of cockpit. And he's able to sort of follow orders and feel like he knows where he is. Over the course of the film, that whole environment morphs and changes and grows and ends up in something which looks more like a prison cell. And I'm sure you noticed, but the window that starts off in front of him in the cockpit and ends up as a much sort of larger window, like an old medieval cell at the end of it, is the same glass window, the same shape as the window that his body can see when he's lying in that incubator at the end of the film.
Duncan Jones, source code opens on April 1st.